This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome, everyone, to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam. I'm your host, and sitting across from me is none other than Richard.
The one and only.
The one and only. Thankfully, there's only one. Richard, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you.
Well, let's jump right into this. We're talking about failure today.
Yeah, well, that's a downer.
Yeah. It happens to everyone.
Well, speak for yourself.
Well, almost everyone fails. If you haven't failed, then perhaps you haven't tried.
Yeah.
As some would say.
Yeah.
This is an inevitability of life is failure, both great and small. Perhaps you can avoid great failures, but there are going to be setbacks along the way.
Yeah.
And especially as it pertains to leadership. So how do you handle that?
Well, you're right, Sam. We're all going to have at least times in our life where we would like to do a do-over. It might not even be a total
reset
failure.
Button there?
Yeah, it's like but I know I could do better on that one. And I've had a lot of times, just even sermons or talks or different things where it's not that it was even bad necessarily, but it could have been better. And you look back and think, I just if I'd been a little more prepared, if I whatever. And then there's times in your life where there's just outright failures. You just messed up. You fell on your face, and sometimes they can be quite severe failures that cost you your job, can cost you your marriage, can cost you your relationships. Very severe failures that obviously you want to address. And so, but it's one thing you know that in living you're probably going to experience that.
Yeah.
It's part of being human, I think, is to fail. And so, for me, just in watching leaders and studying biographies, it's not that great leaders don't fail. It's that great leaders gain the most from their failures. They grab hold of those failures, mine what they can from it for good, and change their direction, maybe change some of the way they've been behaving, and they come out stronger than ever. And so if you're going to come out stronger every time you have a failure, well, you're going to have enough failures that you're going to come out pretty strong eventually. And so it was said one time early on in the Duke of Wellington's experience that he had kind of a pretty unspectacular showing one day in a battle before he was the top general. And the biographer just kind of said, well, Wellington, he learned what he should not do. And that was at least something. So it's like, okay, I've learned never do this again. So it's okay. I'm a little smarter today because of what I learned not to ever do again.
Yeah.
Of course, eventually, those battles weren't turning points in European history. But by the time that he learned from those early failures, one day he's going to be at the battle site of Waterloo, facing the most fearsome opponent of his era in Napoleon, and he's not going to make mistakes. He's going to get it right. And so a lot of time what I found in life is, especially earlier on, it's all preparatory for what really important work we're doing later. So earlier in your life, if you're having failures, don't let that destroy you, that you're probably not doing your life's primary work yet anyway. So just learn from it and grow. And so when those big assignments come, those really important issues, you've learned so much earlier on that you're ready now to tackle the important thing.
Right. So let's assume that we've just blown it.
For some of us, we don't even have to assume.
Yeah. So now what? What do we do?
Well, a number of things, Sam, and this is not just I'll kind of try to walk you through some of the things. I think the first thing you need to do when you fail is accept responsibility. Just admit you failed. I know some folks that just cannot bring themselves to admit they failed. They're going to blame other people. They're going to try to spin it. They're going to justify it. and it's hard to mine something that you won't even claim. If it's not your failure, if it's not your fault, then it's hard to learn. You're spending so much time trying to deflect responsibility that you don't have time just to say, okay, what can I learn from this, and how can I be better as a result? So, if you messed up, and I'll tell you what, I've been in management long enough that when you find someone that did mess up, I think I can be fairly tolerant of people who mess up, but only if they'll admit they messed up.
Yeah.
If they just keep trying to deflect and justify and not take responsibility, that is, to me, that's a much bigger issue than just messing up.
Yeah.
They just can't. If you can't take responsibility for what you've done, you're never going to grow, and you're never going to get better. So accept responsibility. And secondly, I would just say recognize that failure is an event. It's not an identity. You are not, because you failed, it doesn't mean you are a failure. It means you did something that didn't work. That's an event. You move on from that event. But I know some people that see themselves as a failure the rest of their life.
Yeah. We like to label,
And so some things can be significant setbacks. I mean, you may have divorced. You may have experienced divorce, whether you wanted to or not. And so what do? We call people divorcees. Well, they did divorce, but is that their identity?
Right. That
going
doesn't
forward?
encompass.
Because maybe that's humbled them. Maybe they have had a fresh encounter with God, and they've changed, and they're not the same person they were that led to that failure in their marriage. But now we've labeled them a failure. And so I would say, no, focus in on, now some of our failures do come from our character. Some of our failures are a result of character issues. But still, the character can be adjusted. God could set you free. So don't think that that's a life sentence now to be a failure the rest of your life. You failed at that particular thing, but tomorrow will be a fresh new day to get it right. And so it's not an identity. And a similar thing is, I know some people sort of freeze frame their failures. I've been on a lot of Zoom calls lately, and now and then the internet kind of freezes, and I've been talking away, and all of a sudden I realize all the faces on the screen are not moving. They're either fast asleep, or and I'm looking at everybody just kind of caught, frozen in time. And I think sometimes
that guy's been eating a sandwich for 3 minutes.
That's the longest yawn that I've seen. Like, it just never ends. But sometimes we do that with our failures. It's like it just frozen in time, and we just beat ourselves up every day over it, and we just keep rehearsing it. It's always before us. And I would say when you do fail, take a close look at it. I mean, analyze it, break it apart. Don't just ignore it or turn away from it. But at a certain point, when you have basically pulled everything you can of worth or value out of that failure, then move on. Don't let that just be ever before you. You don't have to flagellate yourself for the rest of your life because of a failure when you were 19. It's at a certain point that's in history, and there's new frames now in your life. There's new parts of your story. I've kind of alluded to this already, but just don't get in the habit of blaming others for your failures. There are times where people let you down. That's not necessarily a failure. If someone told you something and you believe they were telling the truth, and that's maybe in poor judgment. But be careful that the people I feel like that grow the most are the ones who are the quickest to take responsibility.
Yeah.
And you may have been let down, and you may have been lied to, and maybe you should have done better due diligence, and you should have verified what you were being told. You should have responded to those red flags that were coming up, and you didn't. Analyze all that and say, yeah, that guy did lie to me, but here's 3 or 4 things I could have done to not been victimized if I had been more careful. So I'm not going to focus on him and what he did. And something I just thought of recently. If I've had people basically say, I could be successful if only that person did such and such. And if your success hinges on what someone else does or doesn't do, then you're going to be in rough shape. Your success, as much as possible, needs to be based on what you're going to do. And now that, I realize there are things that, are beyond our control.
Sure.
We can't hire ourselves to the ideal job or give ourselves a book contract, whatever. But ultimately, our success is going to come by how we conducted ourselves and the quality of work we produced and the way we handled ourselves in that job interview or whatever else.
Yeah.
And so just even if there are some things you could blame on others, it's just not fruitful to do that. So just focus on you. And failure, a fifth thing I would say is to process it properly, you need to embrace humility.
Yeah.
Success does not generate humility. It fosters pride. But failure is a great way to learn humility. And I think, and we've touched on this with some of the biographies before, but I think a couple of good failures early on in your career is great. You don't want to go too far into your leadership career without a failure, because you're going to think way too much of yourself, and you're going to think you just have the golden touch.
I don't know why everybody's saying it's so hard.
Yeah, I don't need to read a book. Look at all this. Look how good I am when I haven't read a book in years, and I haven't sought advice from anybody in years. And look at my success. So it's actually a gift a lot of times to have an early failure, because pride has a lot of downsides to it. Yeah. But genuine, godly humility has a lot of upsides to it. And I've known just, there have been studies like Good to Great and others that have found one of the chief qualities of very successful leaders is humility. And it doesn't mean that they're a wallflower. It doesn't mean that they lack confidence. They may be very confident, but in a humble sort of way. Mm-hmm. They know what they're good at. They know what they're not good at. They stay in their lane. They don't take all the credit when they know a lot of it belongs to their people. So, that embrace humility in your failure. If you're not humbled by your failure, you haven't taken a close enough look at it yet. And learn. Just there are lessons to be learned from every failure. It's like getting a master's degree in leadership. If you'll just unpack the failures and ask yourself, what does this tell me about me? Where does this highlight my shortcomings? Maybe I'm just too quick to make decisions. I should have done a bit more homework on this one. I had some red flags, but I just blew them off. I just thought I was being too worrisome, and I felt a time pressure, and really maybe I had more time than I thought I did. My wife said she had some misgivings, but I just blew that off. It's she's never been in my position. What would she know? And there's lots of things you can look at and say, I took on too much. I was overextended. I made this mistake because I just didn't have the bandwidth. I should have hired some people to take some of this load. There's lots of things that you can learn from every failure. In fact, I if we had the time, I probably could identify maybe some of my greatest strengths that I have as a leader. I could probably point to a failure in my life where I realized I needed to do that. Sometimes it's just a failure and you say to yourself, I am never going to do that again. That's once is enough in a lifetime. And that hurt, and I don't want to hurt like that again. So next time I'm just not, when that temptation comes or that pressure comes or that fear rises up within my spirit, I'm just going to put my head down and do the right thing anyway. Yeah. And so there's a lot to be learned if you're willing to. And so anytime you have a failure, you may have to lick your wounds for a few days. You may have to have a good cry. And then when you've gotten past that initial shock of the failure, then get your Bible, get a notepad, get alone with God, and say, okay, God, help me to learn from this. What are my takeaways from this failure? And there's always pages of notes you can take if you'll just take time to unpack it. A lot of times we're just so busy trying to get beyond. I
I
don't,
just want to get past it.
Let's just move on and get to the next thing. I got summarily fired in this job and horrible review. And so I'm just going to hit the pavement tomorrow and get a new job and start focusing on that. And I would say, well, but you're going to have all the same bad habits, all the same weaknesses that you're going to take straight into the next job. And I've known people that got fired 4 times in a row for the exact same issue. And they didn't learn. They were just busy trying to get employed again. And so they just keep carrying the same Achilles heel with them from job to job, and it keeps doing them in. So I would just say you ought to, if you haven't learned anything from a failure that you've had recently, you haven't looked closely enough. So take time, and that might mean that you get certainly a leadership coach is a great kind of person to. You may just need to meet with a coach a couple of times, but when you have a significant failure, get someone, an outside, objective, impartial source to help you unpack and think through and dig down deep. And it's like every plane crash. Every time a plane crashes, they get the black box. They look at, they get all the pieces of the plane and they reassemble it, and they figure out, because they don't want that to ever happen again. They don't want whatever caused that plane to crash. They don't want that to occur a second time. So. And I would say, well, when you crash and burn in a failure, find that black box, get the data, look at what you were doing that led up to that failure. Were there warning signs that I just overlooked? Did I just make some glaring mistakes? If I had just not done that or said that or responded that way, it would have been a whole different. Unpack it and then say, no, so what can I learn? What will I do differently as a result? And boy, I tell you, it's like getting a master's degree in leadership, just taking time to learn from some of your failures.
That's great. And so let's take a quick break here, and we'll wrap up when we come back. Twice a year, Blackaby Ministries hosts a spiritual leadership coaching workshop in the Atlanta area. The focus of this workshop is learning how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda. The next workshop is October 26th to 28th, and registration is open now. The early bird rate is available until September 26th, and space is limited. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org. Links will be in the show notes. All right, so Richard, we've failed. We've identified the failure. We've taken some steps to assess what went wrong. Maybe before we wrap up here, what's the action plan to get back on our feet?
Yeah, well, we before the break we kind of ended with learn from your failures, but part of learning then is coming to some conclusions to say, so what adjustments do I need to make?
Yeah.
Now I know what I did wrong, but
it's not enough to just identify the problem.
Yeah, it's like I'm a jerk to people. Okay, now I know why I keep getting fired and why people keep quitting under me.
So you go on being a jerk and keep getting fired.
Okay, so
and now you know.
Yeah, and at least now I'll know why I keep failing in the future. But yeah, so you say, so how do I stop being a jerk to people?
Yeah.
How do I? Obviously, every time and for instance, I've known people that they just had a quirky, sort of harsh sense of humor, and they think that they're just being funny, but people are leaving in tears in meetings with them, and they're making a comment about somebody just as they pass them in the hallway, and the person is just so ticked off and angry the rest of the day at that rude comment. You think you're just being friendly. And so, when you figure out, okay, when I'm just joking, but I'm alienating myself from 3/4 of all the staff, then, okay, now you've learned, you know what the problem is. And you may say, well, but I just mean well, I'm just trying to be funny. But you realize, okay, but you know what I realized? My humor, it may seem funny to me. It's a
particular breed.
And making fun of other people doesn't always work so well for the other people. And so maybe I just let that go. And so the next time I'm passing someone in the hallway and I get this quirky thought, I just want to make a comment about how they're dressed that day. And I stop myself and realize, I just made a commitment. I wasn't going to do that anymore.
Yeah.
And so Even if it doesn't make sense to me, I just know I've just learned from enough failures that it doesn't work. It's not worth it. I keep thinking it's going to make people happy or laugh. Instead, I've just lost another friend at work. So it's saying, what do I need to adjust? And I remember years ago, I was in high school, and I had an incident that was. I won't bother to unpack the whole thing, but I would consider it a major failure on my part. It was a failure of nerve. It was a failure of giving in to fear. And I knew the right thing to do, and the only thing that stopped me was fear. I was paralyzed. And I remember at the time, I was might have been the 12th grade, a senior. But something came up, and it was an opportunity for me to step up and make a difference. And I wanted to. I had people around me, like telling me, Richard, this is you. This is on you. You need to step up. And I just paralyzed with fear. And I always regretted that. And I look back later, and it cost me. People that it would have endeared them to me had I not been afraid to just step up. But fear caused me to hesitate, to not jump into the mix and make a difference. And boy, I tell you, for a while there, I just beat myself up and thought, Richard, what kind of coward, what kind of failure are you that, you just, like, what kind of wimp, that you could have made a difference, and you just stood there kind of not doing anything. And for a while there, I kind of went through the process of beating yourself up and being hard on yourself, which is fine to do a bit if you deserve it. But at a certain point, I remember just saying to myself, this is so unpleasant. I just don't want that to ever happen again. So how am I going to not let that happen again? And I realized, okay, I'm sure I'm going to be fearful again. I'm sure I'll be in an awkward situation, and I'll think, what do I do if I step up or if I speak up? How will that be perceived, and will it be worse? And I'll just want to go away and avoid the conflict. And but what am I going to do? And I remember, even just as a senior in high school, just saying, the next time something like that happens, I'm just going to will my feet into action. I'm just going to start charging toward the fire, and everyone else may be running away from the fire. God, just help me to be the kind of guy that just charges into the fire if I have to. And so, I remember just consciously thinking through. And one of the things you can do with that is, sometimes it's helpful, is imagine scenarios. Imagine another scenario similar to that one. And picture yourself, what will you do then?
Yeah.
And that's not bad. I don't think that's mind over matter. It's just trying to prepare yourself, because there's going to be other crises, there's going to be other awkward moments. And so just rehearse in your mind ahead of time. Okay, and when that does happen, what will I do? How will I respond? Let me think it through now, so I don't just stand there paralyzed when that happens. And I remember years later, I was the president of a seminary, and I'd had an awkward conflict with someone that was in a position of great influence over me, that had the potential to hurt me in my work if he chose to. And I had stood up to him, and I'd upset him. I wasn't trying to be a jerk, but he had crossed some ethical lines, and I called him out on it, and because it was affecting our school. And he didn't like it. I heard later, he was venting and not very saying nice things about me at his office. And so I knew it was pretty awkward. And this guy is a pretty intimidating guy. And I remember that at one point I had to leave my office suite area to go out somewhere. And so I'm busily charging off, walking at a brisk pace out my area of the school. And I look up, and at the other end of the building is this very person, this man that I know is upset with me. He doesn't work in my building, but for some reason he's come over to my building. And so if I keep walking where I'm going, I'm going to have to cross paths with him. And
Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to be an ugly scene. And so I'll tell you, it was funny, but I just stopped and I thought, oh, do I need a conflict right now? Do I need that? It's a busy day. I've got a lot on the go. So I started to turn around and go back into my office, and I thought, I'll just run this errand an hour from now when he's gone, and
did I leave my keys on the desk?
I thought I'll just save myself the conflict. And I'm about 2 steps backward, but I had thought through this scenario, and I thought, you know what? There's going to be those awkward moments where I get fearful. I just don't want conflict. I start to rationalize why it'd be better just to avoid this conflict right now. He's already mad at me. Probably doesn't need to see me right now. But then, I had these other voices and saying, but do you remember how bad you felt when you gave into fear the last time? And when you started to rationalize and basically what I felt like God said is, this is your property. I mean, this is your place of work, and you run this place. He's on your territory right now. And don't you ever hide from people when it's at your workplace. You're the boss. And, if wolves come onto the property, the shepherd doesn't need to be back in the corner office avoiding conflict. It's you're the shepherd of this place, and so get out there. And so I remember just deciding, hey, that guy knows I work here, and he knows if he steps on my property, there's a good chance he may run across me, and he's just stepped on my property. And so if anyone's going to feel awkward about that, it ought to be him. So I turned around and I just kept charging forward, and he actually kind of saw me coming, and he ducked out. And I thought, all right. And eventually we worked things out and actually were very cordial in years to come. But in that moment, I just thought, that failure of nerve back when I was in high school, I know how bad that felt. I know how much I regret that. And I'm just not going to, I can't redo that one, but I can certainly avoid having more regrets down the road. And so, as bad and painful as, that was nothing life-threatening, back in high school. Just a thing I wish I could do over, but it probably saved me a number of other failures down the road, because I didn't just beat myself up over it. I thought to myself, so the next time I face a similar thing, what am I going to do? And sure enough, a time came and it kicked in, and because I thought it through and made some decisions about how I'm going to respond, I dealt with it differently. Maybe just one or two last things. I should have said this at the beginning, but pray. When you fail, just let God help you. Spend time with God over your failure. God is a very gracious God. He's not going to just beat you up over it. He's not going to drag it out. He's a master at pulling gold out of failures and saying, here's what you need to learn. Here's why it went wrong. Richard, here's some stuff in your life that is going to make you vulnerable until you address this and you get over this. And he also, God's great at bandaging up wounds and saying, boy, you got beat up on that one, didn't you?
Yeah.
Let me help you patch you up and heal you and scrape off this, and we'll get some ointment here, and you'll be better in a few days. But what can we learn from this? And so don't be afraid to take your failures to God. He's not going to, you may have grown up in a home where any failure was condemned and ridiculed, but that's not who God is. God wants you to grow. He wants you to be healed from what you experience. And so get to him as quickly as you can. And I've had those moments where I just felt like I messed up. And as soon as you can, you kind of get alone, you get on your knees and say, God, boy, I know you saw this coming, but I should have seen it coming. I just wasn't prepared. And God is great about that. And the last one, just hold yourself accountable. Sometimes you make a commitment, but then the next time it comes around, you mess up again, and because you didn't follow through. You sort of knew what you should do the next time, but you didn't do it. And I just find that, and I've talked about this before, but you may want to just get with a a prayer partner. You might want to get with a couple other people that you meet with periodically, and you process some of that. And for a number of years, I've shared. I met with 3 other guys, maybe about every other month or so. We would meet and we would unpack situations like that with the other guys, and we'd tell them, I just want to tell you guys about an incident that I'm just hurting over, and I'm embarrassed about, and I just don't want that to happen again. And so they'd be great. They'd say, well, what are you going to do differently? What happens when that happens again? And and then when the situation would come up, I'd need to report in with them. Okay, guys, I got to give you an update. A similar thing happened. Let me tell you what I did this time, and get the feedback. Again, a leadership coach is a great tool to just say, there's just too many people that just are not mining and learning and processing their failures, so they just keep repeating them. Get a leadership coach and say, help me to think through, because we have a tendency to justify stuff and to feel like we're just the victim and it wasn't our fault and he's to blame, and you learn nothing from that. You change nothing from that. But a coach, somebody objective, a group, an accountability group,
somebody outside your own head.
That just says, hey, come on, don't slough that off too much. You could have done this, you could have done that. You didn't have to respond that way. And so, sometimes your spouse is good for that. I find a lot of times spouses sometimes they're too quick just to be on our side and agree with us. And so they're not always as helpful as an accountability group, but someone that will speak truth into your life is great. Yeah. And so have the courage. It'll hurt. I promise you it'll hurt at the time. It'll be embarrassing at the time, but for years and years to come, you may avoid a dozen even more serious failures because you're willing to face the pain early on with this one and make the adjustment so you never did that again.
Well, that's great. We'll just leave it here.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.